Turtle Clan, Snipe Clan, Wolf Clan, Beaver Clan. You know, they list all the Bear Clan. All the Tuscaroras who came back in were brought in by the Five Nations as family and made the Six Nation of the Iroquois Confederacy. So we have this dispersion. And so when I'm talking about early Underground Railroad, I'm talking about the fact that Native Americans have been enslaved. After this war, even more Native Americans are enslaved on plantations in Virginia and North Carolina. They have relationships with the Five Nations and what will become the Six Nations, including the Tuscarora. They have lost their children, their wives, their daughters, their sisters, their mothers, and their fathers. And they have intermarried with all of the Five Nations. So there are Cayuga who are impacted. There are Senecas that are impacted. There are Mohawks that are impacted. And they all want revenge. And when they come back to the South, they come back to North Carolina, and they come back to Virginia, they will get their people. And they will take them back to New York State and back to their settlements in New York State. This is what I'm saying, the beginnings of the Underground Railroad. They know the way. And they're taking not just Indian people, they're taking mixed blood people, people who are part Indian and black, people who are part Indian and white. They're taking all of their people, whenever they can find them and wherever they can get them, they're taking them back to their homeland, back to New York State. So we see this happening from throughout the 1700s. We see them having constituted themselves as the Six Nations. All of the nations of the Northeast and the Ohio Valley are part of the Confederacy. If you can see these, I don't know how clear they are to you, but you see Tuscaroras laying across Virginia. You see the other nations, the Kanoi. You see the Senecas up in New York State. If you all can follow this map, it's a map of northeastern United States. You know, the Chesapeake is down to the south. I don't have my pointer. Can you all see that?
Yep.
Even in the Ohio Valley, they have Delaware Indians and Shawnee Indians. All of these Indians are the friends and allies of the Five Nations. All of these Indians intermarry with the Tuscaroras and the Five Nations. And so all of these Indians know these trails and these routes, and they are coming to the south to get their people and bring them back. Now, I left one other thing out in terms of understanding the conflicts between the northeastern Indians and the southeastern Indians. It's important to understand that the southeastern Indians, they didn't just slave the Tuscaroras. They slaved the Delawares, they enslaved the Shawnees, they attacked and they took Native people as slaves and took them to Charleston, South Carolina, and sold them to the South Carolinians to be shipped to the British Caribbean all over the American Southeast. So all of the Indians in the Northeast, all of the Indians in the Northeast, the Delawares, the Shawnee, the Wyandots, all of the Indians of the Northeast, the Ohio Valley, all of them did not care for the Southeastern Indians because they were known as great slavers. And this continental war that was set off after the Tuscarora War, the fighting stopped with the whites, but the Indians fought wholesale against each other over Indian slavery. And when the dust settled, when the war was over, and the Five Nations, the Six Nations defeated the Southeastern Indians, the Indian slave trade ceased to exist. No more Indians would be enslaved. And the whites understood if any more Indians were enslaved, that the Iroquois would go to war. And so African slavery accelerates in the colonies in South Carolina, in North Carolina, and we see more Africans being brought in and used on plantations from Virginia down to Georgia. And we see the Southeastern Indians turn from Indian slaving to supporting African slavery because they become slave catchers in the Southeast. Any Africans that run away from Charleston or from Savannah, Georgia, the Catawbas, the Cherokees, the Creeks will catch them and they will return them to the whites in Charleston and in Savannah in exchange for guns, ammunition, lead, gunpowder. So they become slavers in the Southeast. So what I'm also laying the foundation for you is not just the Quaker relationship with Native people who kind of began the Underground Railroad to secure the freedom of their enslaved people, but I want you to understand that the entire Ohio Valley, what we call Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, the entire Ohio Valley, West Virginia, all belong to the Six Nations, all belong to the Iroquois Confederacy. And they refuse to allow any slavery anywhere in their territory. So they are not just bringing people to the Northeast, to their main settlements, the Tuscaroras in particular, but any Indian nation who is fleeing the enslavement by whites or by other Indians are welcome to come to the Ohio Valley and settle in their territory, and they are protected from slavery. I call it the Tuscarora diaspora. Not only do you see Tuscaroras settling with their kinsmen, but you see these groups of mixed race people that end up being developed throughout call it the northeastern woodlands, the Black Dutch in Virginia, the Redlegs, Creoles eventually down in Louisiana, and I won't go into that story, that's another story, because New Orleans was started by folks from Montreal, and if you look at the early maps, when they went down to Montreal, they took Mohawks with them. And there are Mohawk settlements all around the city of New Orleans. And many of the Mohawks are mixed race people, they're triracials. And they basically set up the city of New Orleans. So many of the people who we call Creoles down in New Orleans, are of Indian African European descent. Melungeons in Appalachia, Lumbees don't want to be called mixed race, although many of them are. They don't want to be called mixed race. Jackson Whites up in New Jersey, what we call Portuguese, also in the Northeast. But all of these mixed race peoples will end up being a part of this, and many of the mixed race people have connections to what we call the Tuscarora diaspora. Because wherever you find mixed race people in eastern Ohio, in Kentucky, West Virginia, throughout North Carolina, wherever you find these large, in New Jersey, these communities, they all have ties. I've done some research on them. They all have ties to the Tuscarora, what we call the Tuscarora diaspora. Because many of the Tuscarora were triracials. They were mixed with Indian, black, and white. So when we talk about creating the earliest Underground Railroad, it has a direct relationship to the Tuscaroras of North Carolina and Indian slavery and or what we call the Indian slave trade. And the later Indian wars to end the Indian slave trade, which involves not just the Northeastern Iroquois Confederacy, but those Indians aligned with them throughout the Ohio Valley. So now I'm coming to the end and keep it checked on time. Am I out of time?
You got 15 minutes.
Got 15 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to wind it down so I have at least 5 minutes for questions if there are questions. So I'm at the end now anyway, I'm winding it down. So I'm moving quickly, but I want you all to just kind of understand the relationship. So as we see settlements developing and being established in the East, we see these settlements expanding to the West. We see the legalization of slavery. Note the date. In North Carolina, slavery is legalized in 1715. Why is it legalized in 1715? What's significant about that time period? The Tuscarora War ends in 1713, and a third of the nation is enslaved. So now you have all of these Indian slaves that are going to be mixed with African slaves, and the state of North Carolina now officially enslaves them in 1715, and they establish slavery. You see that every colony had slavery. All 13 colonies had slavery. In fact, Massachusetts was the first to establish, Connecticut was the first to establish it. Well, Massachusetts in 1641, and then Connecticut in 1650. So all 13 colonies had slavery, but as you see, North Carolina gets into the business a little bit later than its neighbors, Virginia and Georgia. So bringing it to an end, when we talk about the evolution of the Underground Railroad and the legalizing of slavery in North Carolina, again, 1715, you got the Tuscarora diaspora and the Death Trail. 1715, you have the Six Nations waging war on the Southeastern Indians because of their role in the Tuscarora War. And in 1722, we're going to see Byrd establish a dividing line between the Indians of the Northeast and the Indians of the Southeast. If you look at this illustration, and you can find North Carolina. I don't know if y'all can see it from that distance, but can you see Tuscarora in the Piedmont? Written across the Piedmont, Tuscarora. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Okay. Tuscaroras were pushed out of eastern North Carolina, but they were pushed into the Piedmont of Virginia, what is now Forsyth County and Guilford County, and also up into Virginia. And so there's a divide between the northeastern and southeastern Indians, the northeastern Indians being opposed to slavery and non-slave holding nations, and the southeastern Indians who were slave holding Indians, they actually ended up owning Africans as slaves as well. And so there's a divide between the two. And war between the two facilitates or forces a dividing line being drawn between the two to prevent continued conflict between the two. Although Indian slavery has been stopped and they're still trying to get their kinsmen out of slavery and smuggle them to the north, Indian slavery has been stopped, but African slavery has accelerated. So the Indians in the southeast, south of the line, they are still engaged in African slavery as slave catchers and as slave holders. In fact, when the Cherokees were forced to go to Oklahoma, almost a third of the nation were African slaves who they forced marched to Oklahoma and used them to clear land to grow cotton in Oklahoma. So we have the African slave trade accelerate, more and more Africans being shipped from West Africa into the Americas. And of course, I don't have time to go over the condition in which they were shipped in.